try again in 30 seconds. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on another Honeycomb webinar. And I'm delighted today to be joined by Tim and Adam. I will explain shortly why these wonderful men are here. The topic for today's webinar is platform-based consulting. The future is here. And the reason I put this together and asked Tim and Adam to join us is that so much talk at the moment about the way that consulting firms are changing their models or thinking about changing their models, and the impact of AI on all of that, and moving to different pricing models, different engagement models, different ways of creating value for clients. And I asked a question in our internal trainer community a couple of months ago saying, like, what is this whole platform-based consulting thing? Like, what does it really mean? And there seem to be different definitions of it flying around. And Tim and I have been talking over the last few months about various different ways of changing the way of engaging in consulting models. And so I thought, what better thing to do than get on a couple of experts who've actually lived and breathed these types of models in their consulting firms and talk about what it really means to run a model like this. So firstly, just what am I talking about? What is platform-based consulting? The broadly, I've seen two different definitions of this. One is where the consulting value is delivered via a platform, some combination of an embedded, always-on consultant under a retainer model, access to data, proprietary data from the firm, the client data, external data, and just wrapping all of that into this always-on advisory model. The other version of platform I've seen is building internal platform teams within a consulting firm to operate in a different operating model. And I just want to be clear up front, we're not today talking about that second type of platform-based consulting. We're here to talk about the retainer, data embedded, always-on advisory type model. And so I'm going to introduce Tim and Adam, who have both got lived experience of running these types of models and have a whole load of value to share. I realize I've forgotten to just do a technical check. So if anybody wants to dive into the comments and just let me know that you can see and hear me, that would be appreciated. I can see Joe doing that already. So hopefully we're all good. We have from Stellify, Tim Beattie, who is building an awesome platform for aligning the ultimate needs, objectives, and value of clients with those of consultants. And this is the platform that Tim uses in his own consulting engagements. We've been testing it with some of our clients, and I know that he works with a load of other consultants to get value from that platform-based model as well. And Adam is an old friend of mine from Bain days, many years ago. And had got nearly a decade of experience founding and running a data-based embedded insights model of consulting out in Australia, and is also today one of our wonderful Honeycomb training team. So it's awesome to see Adam with a different hat on today, talking to us about this. So without further ado, I'll just hand over to you chaps to give a bit more explanation about what you do, and then we'll dive into the conversation. Tim, maybe you'd like to go first.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me. This is a topic I'm really really passionate about, really interested in having conversations about. So looking forward to this discussion. So I guess my story and how I've ended up building Stellify is I've come from the world of big consulting. Yeah, I've worked for Big Four, PwC, Deloitte. I've worked for IBM. So I've been through, having come up from graduate level, the whole experience of big, long SI ERP transformation programs. I've experienced what it's like to be a consultant on time and materials, on big fixed price risk premium projects. And I've always sort of felt a little bit uncomfortable in terms of the value realization for clients. I worked for smaller boutique consulting companies, and I didn't feel the problem as much. It was still there, but it was definitely different. It was definitely different when I worked for the smaller, more nimble consulting companies. And then for the 6 or 7 years before I started Stellify, I worked for Red Hat Open Innovation Labs, where I was the global head of product. And the goal of our engagements there, our services engagements, was all around enablement. And it was all around delivering business value to the end customer. And interestingly, it wasn't about keeping ourselves engaged as people. It wasn't about trying to get extensions and renewals from a people perspective. It was about making the product, the technology, high value. And this, my 6 years there, gave me some ideas for, I hesitate to whether to call it a platform or software. I think the term I've landed on is an operating system. It's a way that we can anchor services that we deliver, or if there's a product involved, a product that we're selling, anchored around the outcomes that the client is trying to achieve, the problems we're trying to solve for the client, and how we will measure progress towards those. And that was the starting point for the operating system that we built. Can we anchor everything around the end client's outcomes? Can we use that as the main data point to focus on? And as we've evolved the technology that we've built, we've been exploring how can we engage in different ways that doesn't involve 5 days a week, 8 hours a day on site, which is very expensive and sometimes very wasteful. But how can we make our expertise more accessible, available to the client when they need it? And how can we connect the value of our services to those outcomes? And with data and AI, I just think that now is the time where there's some huge possibilities to kind of rethink the way a very traditional industry has been operating for many years.
Awesome, love it. I love that you brought out that, like, is it platform, is it software, is it operating model? Like, I think that's exactly the type of thing people are wrestling with. And to my mind, like, if it becomes software, then it's not really consulting anymore. So yeah, we need to kind of tease that through. Adam, how about you? How have you ended up on this call? And tell us a bit about yourself.
That's a good question. So my background, as Deri said, we met at Bain, but after Bain, I founded a loyalty and customer analytics consultancy down in Australia. And one of the things we found was that we didn't go out there trying to build a platform or trying to build a kind of client-facing solution. It was a traditional consulting business where, as you were saying, Tim, you go, you kind of do a project, you sit there with the client, it's time and material to some extent, maybe a bit of value price. But often, because we were very data driven in our model and our approach, every engagement kind of followed a similar process. We would ask for CRM data or transactional data. We'd maybe bring in some third-party data sets. You'd spend some time cleaning it and reconciling it and doing your ETL up into some, analytics platform. You'd run the same analytical processes because that was the way you did things. And then you'd make a nice PowerPoint, you take it to the client, and you'd make your recommendations. And there was nothing wrong with that, and the client saw value in that. But internally, we were spending a lot of time doing the same stuff again. And I think we realized that, all of that plumbing, so to speak, that wasn't creating the value. The value was the insights and the decision support that effectively we were offering the clients. And so what we did was we built what we call the kind of data cloud or the insight cloud that would automate all of that repeatable work. And once that was automated, implicitly you get a better margin because your analysts aren't working on the same stuff all the time. The turnaround is much quicker, and you're delivering a high value product because you've got better decision support and better insights. And once we've done that for one client, you start to think to yourself, okay, well, I've actually got a product here. This is something I could then lead with and sell into other clients, which is then what we did. Actually leading with the dashboard, the tooling, the analytics support, as opposed to leading with the consulting proposition. Now, we didn't always lead with the product. Sometimes, you got to make the right decision. What's the best opportunity for the client? But it gave us another string to our bow, and it opened up a different type of conversation with the client.
Nice. Yeah, and I think that'll resonate with a lot of people, that experience of is there a way we can do this faster, better, more consistently, and particularly in the AI world that we're all starting to navigate now. That feels very front of mind, and certainly something that I'm thinking about an awful lot at the moment is how do we standardize stuff enough that we can then layer into anything that looks like a platform requires a level of standardization. So I'm going to ask these chaps. No, go on, Adam. Go on.
Go on.
So I was just going to say to people watching, I'm going to ask a few questions. I'm curious about a lot of things here, but I also really want you guys to get your questions answered. So whether you're watching on StreamYard, on LinkedIn, on X, on YouTube, wherever you're watching, add questions into the comments, and I will pick them up, or Joe behind the scenes will pick them up and make sure that we get them answered as much as possible. We'll do that as we're going through, so don't hesitate. Just fire questions in, and we'll pick up what we can. Use the comment section to do that. Sorry, Adam, you were going to add a thought before I dive into my first question.
And I was just going to say, you were talking about kind of the automation with AI, and I think what was the benefit for us was obviously we had the internal benefit around the automation, but you also had the external benefit as well of kind of the longer client. You could start to build retainer-based models, longer client relationships, richer conversations, more valuable decision support. So everything, kind of both sides of the ledger, benefited because your costs effectively got more efficient, but the pricing model, the longevity of that with the client, and the richness of those relationships all were improved as well.
So I think the pricing model that sits around these types of engagements is super fascinating. I'm going to resist my temptation to dive into that because I think it's downstream of a couple of other things that I think people need to think about first. So one of the things that it strikes me is that if you are a generalist consultant going to market saying, we've got a bunch of smart people and we help people in industry X solve a bunch of different problems, that's hard to convert into a platform type model. You've got to have a level of standardization and precision in who you help, the problem that you solve, and how you solve that, which is broadly what I would call your proposition, in order to be able to layer this type of thing in. Otherwise, there's too many degrees of freedom around the data inputs that you might need and the data outputs that you might need and the way you engage. So what would you guys say, and Tim, maybe I'll come to you first, is what would you say is the kind of characteristics of how if someone's sitting here watching this, running a consulting team, leading a firm, thinking, I'd love to get to more of a platform-based model, what are the building blocks that are necessary? Is it around the proposition, around how they're organized, around the type of consulting that they do? Do you think, how would you think about that?
Yeah, good question. So as is often the case, I think it starts with mindset of the client and mindset of the provider. And where I have seen this approach work well is where there is a really good level of trust and mutual respect, that we both exist, these two parties exist, and we can both get value from working together. So I think the kind of engagement, if I think about a traditional consulting engagement, they tend to be finite, project-based, start date, end date, and they create a moment of change. They create usually an energy, an inspiration, a demand to move forward. But what businesses really need is continuous progress. They're looking for outcomes. They're not really buying a one-time experience. They're not really buying necessarily a training course or a workshop or a document. What they really want is an outcome, and that nearly always takes time, and it nearly always takes various twists and turns and getting things wrong and getting things right. So I think the kind of when we're asking the question, how do we keep the transformation, the thing that we've started in the room, which I still believe is very important to start these things with humans in a room, no AI, no computers, no data lakes or anything like that. How do we keep that transformation alive between the in-person engagement? And I think where that is an interesting question, and saying, because that's what we need, then it's probably a good engagement to think about, well, this kind of operating system, this kind of on-demand, asynchronous versus synchronous, consultant in your pocket kind of model could be really interesting to explore. So that's probably my starting point. Now, I think both sides have got to be up for that and think that makes sense, because we have an outcome we want to achieve, and it's not going to be a one-time thing. So both the buyer and the seller needs to recognize that, and there needs to be a level of trust that, yeah, these are the people that are going to help us achieve this outcome. We're not quite sure how they're going to do it yet, and every single nut and bolt is not fully understood, but we can tell that these are good people that can help us reach our outcome. And if we've got that level of mutual respect, trust, and belief, then I think we have the foundation for an interesting kind of engagement.
Yeah, so that the whole idea of it being a retained consulting engagement implies it's a long-term thing and a trusted partnership. With the commercials to match.
I used to deliver a lot of agile training. I used to be a Scrum trainer, and I used to deliver these 2-day courses to certify Scrum Masters and certify product owners. And the reality is, you cannot become an experienced product owner or Scrum Master in 2 days. There's a moment that stuck with me where I was delivering to a group of different clients. It was an open enrollment, and there was a lady from the NHS who said to me in the wrap up, "I wish I could take Tim in my pocket. I wish, because I know when I go back to work next week and I'm going to explore some of these ideas, I wish I could get Tim out of my pocket, because I think we could continue the conversation." So, but we never had a commercial model that would allow for that kind of flexibility and accessibility. It was either, well, you can buy Tim and this is his day rate and you'll have to book him, or we'll have to build him into a big project. So if we can come up with a model where you are, subscribing to the expertise, you've got access to that expertise when you need it, it's going to be it could potentially be much, much more valuable, and you can see that value materialize.
Nice. Adam, what's your thoughts on so I think Tim's describing there like the duration and like ongoing need for behavior change and transformation, and using a platform-based model to enable that. My sense is that the model that you were running works slightly differently, but am I wrong about that?
Yeah, so it was, because I guess our model is less about behavior change and more about how do we standardize the work that we're doing to give an ongoing, kind of repeatable service, not really even repeatable, ongoing delivery of insights to the client, and then wrap a high value consulting layer around that. And I think when you were speaking before about, what do you need to have in place, I almost think I made it sound too easy that we realized we were doing this data coming in and we just built a platform for it. But actually, I think a prerequisite for being able to do that in our case was standardizing the analysis that we were doing, because often you'd get the data in from the client, and client A, client B, client C, and you end up doing similar work with the data, but there's always nuances, and you think, oh, we could cut it this way for this one, and we'll give this a KPI for that one, and this analytical approach for the other one. And we actually, as a prerequisite, had to standardize that thinking. And we were almost sitting down with the analysts saying, okay, I need you guys to come up with a code, an analytical code that we can repeat that basically does 90% of what we always do and does it now in a standardized fashion. And that was the prerequisite, was forcing us to kind of consolidate our thinking and standardize our thinking. Once we had that, the platform stuff actually became a lot easier, because you can then take that, put it into an environment, build a dashboard tool around it, work out the most high value ways to present it for your client, and create the actual infrastructure and the architecture for them to engage with. But I think you do have to go through that prerequisite step first of actually finding the repeatable components in the work that you do. And I think that's the trick. The trick is identifying what are we repeatedly doing that can be automated. And once you find what you do repeatedly that can be automated, then you can build the platform around that. But there has to be some repeatable component, or at least for us there was.
I think that's really interesting, Adam, because you're kind of you're utilizing some really good engineering practices, but in a non-technical aspect. Because when we build systems or applications or technology, these days automation is our friend. And I always say when I'm coaching, if someone in your team does the same thing more than once, it is a candidate for automation. And this is where over the years we have started to automate tests, we've started to automate documentation, we've started to automate release processes and deployment processes, and where the whole DevOps movement has really come from. And I think what I'm hearing you say is when you go to do an engagement which maybe involves some analytics or insights, your team are doing something, you're doing the same sort of thing again. So of course it's a candidate for automation, and that means you're faster, you're probably more accurate, because we don't make as many mistakes whenever you get automation in there, and you're kind of getting you're embedding your IP, your smartness, your expertise into that automation. So
yeah, because IP is actually what it is, right? You spend all this time thinking about in methodology, I'm going to take this customer data and I'm going to slice and dice it in this way with this method to show these insights that are going to drive value for the client when presented in a certain way. The code, the automation allows you to kind of bake that in, and that becomes the repeatable asset that you can then take to different clients and wrap your advisory work around those insights.
So this is we've had a question in from Kieran, which I'm going to just pull up onto the screen for people to see, because it's very relevant to the conversation we're having now. So Kieran has asked, frankly, Kieran, I think this is an almost impossible question to answer without saying it depends, but we'll have a shot. So when you've got the platform and the repeatable models within it, in your case, Adam, and then you've got this advisory wrapper around the outside of it, there's a question about, and this is gets to the kind of age-old challenge for a lot of consulting firms of they get jealous about the equity multiples that software businesses command, and they say, well, hold on a minute, if our business is only worth 5 times EBITDA and we build a bit of software and it can be worth 15 times EBITDA, that seems like a great thing to do. And then they realize that building software is a very, very different game to building a consulting firm. And what we're talking about is this blending of the two, and particularly as it's got easier and easier to do that, or at least think you're doing that with AI tools and vibe coding. And then it draws out this question that Kieran's posed of, as value starts to come from access to the platform versus the advisory work, how do we think about that ratio? At what point is it no longer consulting? And the acid test question here, which I think is really valid, is how do you then sell it differently? Do you think about selling it differently? I think, Adam, you mentioned earlier that sometimes you lead with the platform, sometimes you lead with the advisory. What is there a standard tipping point where we could think something stops being consulting, or is it just it depends?
I think it depends on what you mean by value. Will be my kind of answer it with another question in a way, right? Because if by value you mean that the thing that makes the client go home, sleep sound in their bed, so to speak, knowing that everything's under control and they've got a trusted advisor, that's always going to be the consulting expert. I don't think a platform, a piece of software on its own can be the trusted advisor that's going to make the client sleep at night, right? But if you think of value purely from a financial basis, like what makes the client sticky, what keeps your foot in the client's door, what gives you a reason to turn up every week at their offices and have your check-in meetings and pick up the phone or send an email, well, the platform makes it sticky. And those revenues will keep ticking in come rain or shine, because once they've signed up to it and the insights are flowing through, nobody wants to turn that off. There's too many use cases. So I think that for me is that's how I'd answer the question. I think it depends if you think about, the value in the client's head or the value on your kind of income statement, so to speak.
Yeah. So yes, I'll give the consultant's preferred answer. It depends. It's our favorite words, isn't it? So for me, the idea that it's either platform or consulting expert, it's one or the other. I actually think, and this is back to the point at the beginning, the operating system is a blend of the two, and it doesn't necessarily have to be one or the other. It actually maybe all becomes intertwined. I'll share a couple of examples which might be interesting to the audience. So a couple of years ago, when I was starting out some of the experiments, the CIO of one of my clients asked me for some advice and to review one of his deliverables. And instead of doing it via email or on a call or in a meeting room, I recorded a 10-minute video of me walking through and giving my feedback and giving some ideas about where we could go. And I put this into my platform. It was to be honest, it was a little experiment to see if he would come into the platform, and he did. Now, when I looked at some of our metrics a couple of weeks later, I saw that had been watched 19 times by 10 different people because he'd shared it with his team. But it was still me. It was still me that they were watching on that video. It was still my voice. It was still my IP. It was still my analysis. It was still my thinking. So was that the platform or was that me as a consulting expert? It was sort of a bit of both. What I came away thinking, it took 10 minutes of my time and I delivered 190 minutes of value to different people, and it spread further. And I thought there is definitely an opportunity here to get my expertise out in a different way. So that's sort of one idea. And so the other is like, this is, how do we deliver, if we're talking about the consulting expert being on site, on the client side and billing by the minute or billing by the hour, that's one thing. But if we're thinking about, can that consulting expert deliver their IP, their expertise, their knowledge, their advice, their experience, their war stories digitally? Maybe it's both. Maybe it's in a workshop, but we're recording it. There's a lot. There's not just putting a video on, but there's other opportunities now with AI, because that is knowledge that can end up in a platform system. That is knowledge that can be queried. That is knowledge that with an LLM, if you're asking about a particular problem, AI can make the reference, Tim said this 6 months ago, and this might be useful to solve that problem. And again, this is still me as a consulting expert. I actually might be off on holiday, or I may have long left that client behind, but they're still tapping into my knowledge expertise. So I think this is where some of the, if we overlap, we're actually keeping the consultant expert there all the time and accessible, and it's the platform that is encapsulating that.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and I think you're dead right on the platform enables the amplification of the consulting expert's advice, and it really, I think this question is it reminds me of the frequent posts that we see where people say that AI has killed the consulting industry because now you can ask Claude to do a bit of research and produce a deck that superficially looks like something you might have paid £1 million to McKinsey for before. And the fundamental problem with that worldview is that they see the deck as the consulting product, and the deck isn't the product any more than the deck is the product less than a platform is a product, because the deck is the vehicle for the advice and the confidence and the decision making that someone needs to make. And the platform here is a vehicle for advice and decision making and confidence that amplifies the consulting expert. So I think great question, Kieran. I can't let a comment from Kieran go past without plugging the fact that Kieran and I have written a book together that is being published in the next couple of months called The Thinking Fix. So watch out for more about that. But thank you, Kieran, for that question. And people, do please keep the questions coming in, because we'd love to answer the things that are front of mind for you. I've got two major themes kind of bubbling around in my head. One is around pricing and price models and how you think about that with these types of engagements, and the other is around the technology side of it, like how technically adept does your team need to be able to create a platform. And it may be that the answer to that latter one is not that adept if you can think of it as record a video and make it available to a large group of people. Like that hopefully is not beyond the technical realms of many people these days. But let's dive into that pricing question first, because I think this is a really key thing. And it's one of the things that, again, is bubbling around for me a lot, is we have the capability now. And one of the things we're working on, the two main things we're working on internally from a proposition kind of game change perspective, are a set of tools that people can use within and before and after our training sessions to help them practice, self-assess, embed learning, etc. And then a similar thing, which is effectively an AI avatar that allows you that is trained on our content, that you can then interrogate and have it interrogate you, and you can share your outputs and get feedback on them, and essentially a consulting coach. And so those tools are things that we can leave behind with clients. We could potentially provide to clients without providing live training. Similarly, if we're to provide kind of always on advisory support, that pricing model is very different to the pricing model of here's a piece of work we're going to do for you with heavy consultant day time on it that we're going to charge in a certain way. And balancing those things to maximize value and impact for people is a challenge, I think. So what I guess we don't need to talk about specifics of pricing, but in terms of like pricing principles and the dangers of margin erosion, and like how have you guys thought about that in the past? Maybe Adam, will come to you first this time.
Yeah, sure. There's probably two things I'd say on price. The first one is that, well, maybe three things. The first thing is, like, in a way, nobody knows, right? You built a new platform, we built a new product. How much should I charge the client for this? It's an open question, right? You're trying to assess the value of the thing. What's the value price of this thing I'm providing? What would a client reasonably pay for it? And I don't think there's a simple answer to that. And if what you've done is unique, then there won't be easy benchmarks either. So you shouldn't beat yourself up if you can't figure out what the right price is. The second thing is, I always preferred, there was an old story. I forget the details of it now, but it was this old story of like a car dealer in America who talked about, the 6 Chevrolets, and when he wasn't selling one Chevrolet, he was selling 6 Chevrolets, because when a person bought the first one, if they had a trusted relationship with them, they'd come back and keep buying them forever, kind of thing. I'm sure it was told in a lot more juicy American fashion than that, but I always took that model on board when I thought about pricing of the services, because I thought to myself, well, look, if someone's going to sign up for this product, they'll probably have it at a minimum for 2-3 years, right? So the net lifetime value of those subscriptions is huge, and I'd much rather have a slightly lower price point that lasts for another year or two, where the client just feels really comfortable paying that monthly amount, than a price point that makes them wince every time they have to pay that invoice, and they just can't wait till the end of the 12-month term to pull the plug on it. And so that always made me feel much more comfortable with a slightly lower level, knowing there might be a longer lifetime value on it. And the third thing I'd say, I think, is around the value of the decisions that it enables. So, we had 2 products at one point. One product, for example, would look at market share, and we would take banking data, credit card data, that would look at the population spend across a certain sector, and you could take your client's data, and you could say, my client X, I know the customer spend is this. I can look at the population spend, and I can see the relative market share of my client versus the population. And when their sales grow, I can see whether that's because the whole market grew or whether they grew market share. And that's nice, right? It's a nice piece of insight, and it helps the client understand how they're doing relatively in the market. But it doesn't tie necessarily directly to a high value decision. It's just a nice thing to have, because there's a limit to how much you can charge for that. A different tool we built took in similar third-party data, but actually mapped it demographically to their store estate. And this was for a vet partnership, or a national vet chain, actually. And the idea there was to say, what areas do we not have a store, but where we have a good market share headroom where it would make sense putting a store? So you could take their store data, their store sales data, overlay that with demographic data to understand geographic opportunities. And for that kind of thing, you can imagine that every store costs millions. So to have that kind of input into where am I going to put a store, that's really enabling some high risk, high value decisioning. And you can charge a high price point for that, because what's a few $1,000s or a few £1,000s for a network planning tool when it's going to potentially impact millions of dollars or pounds that I'm going to spend on my store estate? And I think so tying it through to the decisions that enables, I think, is also a really helpful way of thinking about how to price it, and also thinking about how to grow the value in the product itself.
Yeah, I really like that. I mean, essentially that value-based pricing, but in order to unlock that, you've got to have the insight and the knowledge to be able to combine multiple different data sources and hopefully your own proprietary data to create that opportunity for value that they can't replicate easily themselves.
And also, interestingly, the people that were buying that network planning tool was different to people that were buying the market share tool. Market share was attractive to the marketers to understand their media spend budgets and how that went through the year, and like seasonality and so on. The network planning tool was much more by the commercial team and the property team. So again, you're also tapping different budget pots as well as and different clients within the same organization, as well as just the price point itself, even though the underlying data was pretty similar.
Makes a lot of sense. Tim, how have you been thinking about the pricing model for this type of thing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. As I mentioned in my intro, I transitioned from consulting into a product company when I went to work for Red Hat, and I really learned a lot during my experience around product thinking, selling products, product subscriptions, and the subscription economy in particular, which has been huge for the last decade or so. I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can borrow from or explore or just think about the principles behind. And if you think about any subscription, think about your Netflix subscription. If you look at the data, have I been watching Netflix the last 6 months, and your viewing history says you haven't watched any Netflix, you should probably cancel your subscription. You're not getting value from that subscription. If you've got a gym subscription that you take out in January and then you don't go there, you should cancel your gym. So the principles of that is, I'm paying a monthly fee for a service, maybe with some technology and product, and I expect to see some value. And if I get in the value, I'll keep paying it. Or in fact, I might even move up a tier. I might even bolt some stuff on. So I think this idea of sort of services as a product, we've had things as a service and things as a platform and so on. This is for professional services as a product. Is kind of interesting to explore. And I've managed to experiment with that with a few clients. The key thing is, first of all, understanding, right, okay, they're paying for this operating system. That will be partly investment you've made in building the technology and all sorts of technology. I see Rag mentioned in the comment there. But also the more variable human costs that have been delivering the services. So if you package that into, would you like to subscribe to our expertise for a month? This is what it will cost. You then need to operate in a transparent way to then show, well, every month we're going to show you what we've done, but we're also going to show you the value that we've delivered. And the value, those measurements should be something that the client appreciates and sees as valuable and treats as valuable. If they're seeing that, then we get into a renewal and potentially a growth. So that is my kind of nirvana as the way I would love consulting to go, where it is literally, if you get the value, you keep, it's a long-lived partnership. If the value stops, the client stops paying.
And how do you, I know you've got a very particular way of kind of stacking that value and joining those dots. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, so the way we do it is we anchor everything around the client's outcomes, and that might be a whole set of outcomes of different parts, and we establish what the measures are for success. So unlike a lot of I guess product QBRs, where it will be very much vanity metrics around logins or usage and stuff like that, the focus of how we present that has got to be around something. So what it shouldn't be, well, we delivered X number of workshops, or Y number of people were trained, or or X number of user stories were completed. What clients really care about is revenue trending in the right direction, is cost going down, is customer experience scores changing, is the time to value reducing, are we seeing ROI on AI? So whatever it is that has formed the investment case from the client, we have to anchor that in. And then I capture data around them, what the client has bought in their subscription, in terms of who are we helping, who are we supporting, and how much capacity have they maybe got access to, who's used that, who hasn't used that, what parts of the technology platform are people. So trying to basically provide as much data as we can as to, this is how you're using our operating system, and these are whether your needles are moving or not. If they're not moving, this forms a really good governance, a really kind of authentic and really good value principled governance, because we could say, well, needles aren't moving in the measures that matter to you. It might not be our fault. It might be because of some blocker, but what we're now doing is we're focusing, what do we need to do to get these needles moving towards these outcomes? Because unless that's happened, the whole engagement has been a waste.
Yeah. And that ultimately is what underpins your ability to price. Because if you can definitively demonstrate that the work you're doing is driving value, or the work, Adam, to use your example, like the insights you're providing are enabling major decision making, then the price conversation becomes a lot simpler, I think. And you can then get to a world where you're charging relatively premium subscription rates because you're enabling value on top of them.
And you're potentially making yourselves quite portable. It could be your client says, I'm not quite sure where you can help us, but I know you can help us. I know you've got the skills and expertise. You've proven it through data. So I would like to subscribe to your expertise, and I will move your people, your consultants, to wherever our next set of problems and complexity is. But we're not having to get into a whole new project and commercials every time we do that. We're making the expertise more portable around the organization.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, I'm going to bring in another question that I think is from Oliver. So this is response, Tim, to something you were saying about using technology to maximize value and taking away some of those internal comms barriers, the amplification effect of recording your insights into a video. And I think a really interesting question, that there's a temptation, I think, with AI tooling and vibe coding and being able to build things to rush out this type of platform-based model, with this sense that, like, oh, well, we can make advice accessible, we can make data accessible, we can make insights accessible. And if you're not very careful about the way that you use AI to drive that, it can start to sound very generic very quickly. And so I know you've got a lot of AI embedded into your platform, for example. Like, how do you think about making sure that the Stellify and the Tim Beattie kind of picture, what's the word? Fingerprints is the word that you used. How do you make sure that comes through clearly without it just sounding like something that somebody could have just got from Claude easily enough?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And this is where we put technology to one side and we do focus on the human skills, the consulting facilitation skills, because the thing that will really, really make any response from AI super valuable is context. It's going to be really understanding the problem that they're trying to solve, the pain points, the challenges, the opportunities. So I think the consultant's number one priority is to get all of that context out of people's heads. And that comes from really good facilitation, really good soft consulting skills. It is about creating an environment where people are feeling safe and they're sharing, and we're visualizing the bottlenecks and the problems and the pain points. So loads of practices that consultants can do. And I would really encourage spending, good time on that, days, maybe even weeks, but capturing it as much as possible. And this is where technology can really help, because if you're recording those workshops, even voice recording, a really well facilitated domain-driven design workshop, you're getting all of this wonderful knowledge and context and shared understanding between each other, and now we can then put it into the technology, so that when you start to utilize that technology down the line, maybe some weeks or months later, it's not giving you generic stuff which just sounds like a well-trained up consultant. It's actually talking about contextual examples. It's actually learned stuff that have come out of those workshops that the consultant facilitated. So I think that's the differentiator between that kind of beige consulting, I've just used Claude to generate this deck, versus a highly personalized, highly contextual knowledge base that has been built upon the expertise that the consultant brings as well. So your ways of delivering value, your ways of delivering outcomes, that can then be built into the platform as well. So so that's been my focus there.
I think, and Adam, I think this resonates with your example, because in a way, one thing that might be tempting for people is to set up a set of data feeds that run some standardized analysis that you've done, that is your proprietary method for looking at a certain problem and presenting some information, and then layering on some kind of AI advisory over the top of that to try and reduce your costs and make it always on for the consultant. And I think, Adam, you've talked about the model of the insights with the premium consulting advisory on top of it. My sense is that premium consulting advisory, the human bringing all of their expertise and all of their knowledge to bear to look at those insights and turn that into genuine advice and recommendation that is backed by a human who knows what they're talking about, is where you have to be. And before you can AI enable too much of that advisory layer, you've got to get really good at the human advisory on top of your insights platform.
Totally. Because I remember, we'd get one client would get a monthly feed through, right? All the things would update. We'd get all the marketing data in. We'd get all the market share data in, and you'd run the update, and we'd email the main stakeholders and say, here's your, the dashboards have been updated. Here are the headlines, right? They're a bit old school. Some of them still like PDF attachments to the email, even though there was a dashboard. Every client's different, right? And so, I think at that level, AI would have been super helpful, because the consultants were sitting there kind of coming up with a list of bullet points to say, well, this is what's happened in this area. Here's an interesting trend from your marketing ROI, and here's an interesting trend from where you've gained or lost market share nationally or state-based or whatever it might be. And just kind of pulling up those first, I guess you might call them, first draft insights or first layer insights. That kind of stuff, the trend summary, is very useful for AI. But I don't think any of that could replace, the other times when, you're sitting there in the boardroom and you've got the MD and the CEO having an argument about what the market share means and what they should do about it, and whether it's a relevant metric or whether something else is more important for the strategy of the business. That's where you're the trusted advisor in the room, and you're sensitive to, who's the audience, what are they thinking, what are they feeling, what are their priorities, what are they trying to achieve, all the stuff that sits behind the layer of what it means to be a good consultant. AI can't replicate that. It can't get under the skin of your client and really understand what's going on in their head. At least today, I don't think it can.
No, and actually you risk eroding a lot of that as well. There's themes that have been consistently coming up for me over the last kind of 12 to 18 months about what it takes to have a defensible consulting proposition in this future world where information and analysis, the cost of information and analysis is trending to close to zero, and the accessibility of it is trending close to infinite. I think there's only two really defensible things. One is the strength of the relationships that you've got with your clients and that human to human trust that is very difficult to shortcut or replicate. And the other is proprietary data, proprietary insights that are not accessible to the broad pool of that LLMs are fishing in, that you gather through methods that only you can use in situations that only you have access to. And those two things combined together are what makes a defensible future consulting proposition, in my view. And with the proprietary data and insights, I think it's for a lot of, not all consulting firms, but for a lot of consulting firms, it's going to become a necessary thing to invest in a way of creating a platform-based version of that. And then what a platform is going to look different for different firms, or an operating model, to use your term, Tim. Like that might be a data product that is a bit arm's length subscription, and you're using that as the thin edge of the wedge to get to broad access to a lot of clients, some of whom will then come to you to ask for advisory work. It might be that it's embedded deeply in the way that you operate with all of the clients that you talk to, or something in between those things. But time is flying as always, but I wanted to just make sure we get time to talk about what if someone's sitting there at the moment watching this, running a relatively small firm. We've talked a bit about like the need for proposition and trust and those foundations. We've talked a bit about the pricing model and how that might adapt, and the fact that you've got to be fundamentally focused on creating value and opportunities for clients to support pricing. But from a kind of technical or a process perspective, like what are the things that it's necessary to have in place that people need to fix first before they might start thinking about building a platform like this? Like how deeply technical is it these days? Like what kind of technology are people using? What kind of technical skills are necessary? What other things need to be in place so that someone can go, you know what, I can see a path to some kind of minimum viable product on a platform for my type of consultant? Tim, do you want to take it?
Yeah, I can share some thoughts. So I think it is it's an evolution. It's like any good product. It should be iterative. It should be incremental, and do it a minimal approach. And as you said earlier on, maybe just start by doing some videos, and you don't even need to build your own platform. You use something like Loom, or there's other technology. It's really cheap, just to try it and to see whether you can get engagement from your client that way. That's got to be the number one measure, really. Can I get engagement? Can I get interaction? Can I get collaboration? Is the client valuing me communicating in this different way? So I think you can definitely start small. I think things then to watch out for, having spent nearly 4 years since we wrote our first lines of code, security is going to become really important. And therefore be wary about just vibe coding something very quickly if you're going to then put your client's data in there. So this is definitely getting some expertise on that. I saw Kieran mention a comment around AI RAG, the retrieval augmented generation, which we use in our platform. It's a phenomenal technology. And it's definitely very useful and easy to start to, basically put all of your consulting IP into a RAG knowledge base and then be able to query it. And I think that's
a non-technical folks. Can you just explain what a RAG is?
Yeah, so it's if you imagine it like a big brain full of brain cells. And if you've got all of your playbooks, all of your IP, whatever data you've got, you can feed it into this big knowledge base, and it uses AI to sort of break it apart and learn what the little gems are almost, so that when you ask a question, it's insanely powerful search mixed with AI. So it's a really interesting technology in the world of consulting to apply. We find it insanely valuable if we can build a RAG specifically for an engagement, because then it isn't just our consulting IP, but we're feeding in all of the IP that we're building with the client. But we don't want one of our other clients to accidentally stumble upon that. So this is where, investing in some good technical expertise and assurance becomes really, really important. But we're several years before we got into that, but it is definitely an iterative thing, and measuring, where the value is it adding value on top of your consulting ecosystem that you've got already, and then, continuously improve it, continuously deliver, and continuously enhance it.
Yeah, I would say, like, from my personal experience with heading down this path a little bit, is you can get quite a long way without a technical team or a deeply technical team, but as soon as you flip something into being client facing, you're opening up a whole different level of risk, and that's the point. You at a minimum need some advice on it, I think.
I would also separate the front.
There you go.
Yeah, I would also separate. You can separate the front end from the back end as well. So, like, how you actually deliver the UX that you give a client, whether it's like a Power BI or a Tableau or something that you build yourself. That these days is very easy to do. You can take any data you've got in the back, make a nice pretty dashboard out of it. MVP that with a client or with a user base. The back end is much harder to, we contemplated at one point outsourcing it, and in the end we outsourced the build of it, and we got a third party to build that whole AWS infrastructure for us. But we still had someone internal to catch the ball and to actually manage that on a day-to-day process, who was tech savvy enough to understand how it all worked without having to be skilled enough to build it themselves. But that was very different. That's where that complex data ingestion and analytics goes on. The front end is a much easier thing to play with yourself. So you can split it that way as well when you're thinking about what skills you need.
Great. Yeah, I like that. I like that thinking for sure. We've got 3 minutes left, and we had one question just come in from Stuart, which is a kind of macro question that I'm just going to give you like 10 seconds each to give you a point of view on this. So if we're talking about a model where people can get access to advisory at lower prices, but more people get access, more subscription revenue, are we talking about market growing or shrinking in net terms? What do you think? Is consulting going to grow or shrink as a result of platform-based models?
I would say platforms make the consulting more valuable. And if the consulting is more valuable, you are creating more value. And if you're creating more value, then the market grows because people will pay for that value.
Yeah, I agree. It depends, but very, very dependent on the value being delivered and released, and that's what the platforms have got to show.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I've written a whole thought leadership piece on this about the potential for exponential value creation with some of these technologies, and I think that's what we're going to see. So, Stuart, my answer is the market is going to grow faster than anybody thinks once this starts to bite, because there's so much value that has not been captured out there. So we have to draw a line there. I feel like, as ever with these things, the conversations go very quickly, and we could talk more about all of these different things. So firstly, Tim, Adam, massive thank you for joining me this afternoon. I hope you're not too hot in your studios. I've certainly got some fans going here to try and stay cool. Thank you, everybody watching. Any questions that this has brought up, please do shout. If you want to hear more from Honeycomb, we run sessions like this on a regular basis. We publish articles and various other bits and pieces at least weekly. All of that is accessible through that QR code in the middle of the screen there, or just go to honeycombps.co.uk and sign up for all our mailing lists. If you want to chat to me about anything that's come up today, then book some time in my calendar with the bottom QR code there. And we will see you next week for our 2nd July webinar, talking about the consulting salary report from Tarka Talent. I've got Richard Longstreet joining me to talk about how salaries are moving in consulting firms at the moment. And with that, thank you and have a great day.